Covenant and law, two very important themes within Judaism. We'll talk about covenants, what they are, the ones that occur within the Hebrew Bible, and we'll talk about law on the way to talking about that. Because it turns out that part of the covenant, at least some of the covenants that were made, were keeping the law, and the law is something we'll have to explain. The law was something that Israel was given by God to keep. Okay, so what is a covenant? Well, a covenant, as you can tell maybe by what I'm trying to suggest with this picture, is maybe you could put it like a deal. An agreement, that's probably a little too superficial. You could think of covenants maybe more substantively or more sympathetically as partnerships, or the terms of a partnership. Now, what's really important to realize in understanding the covenants that happen in the Hebrew Bible is to understand that the entire premise of creation within Judaism was a covenant or a partnership. Really more a partnership because it wasn't an explicit covenant made. God created humans to be in partnership with him, and in thus creating them, there was no covenant to be made. They didn't exist yet, right? But he created them to be in partnership with him. We've already talked a little bit about this. They were to co-partner with God in ordering the world. And again, just to hit back on this, I suggested that Eden was only a partial ordering of the world, and that humanity was meant to partner with God to expand the kind of order that he had begun to create in the world. That is part of being the image of God, is to engage in the kind of ordering work that God engaged in the creation of the world. That is part of the command, the first commandment, speaking of law, given to people, which was to spread and subdue the earth, multiply, have babies, and get out there and subdue the earth, order disorder. So it was a partnership. Humans were not supposed to go their own way. God was walking in the garden with the humans before they fell. They were supposed to be in partnership with him in creating that order. They could not do it without him. They had to be in his presence, and his presence was there with them initially. Okay, so humanity was created in partnership with God. They didn't create a partnership after they were created, right? It's not like he created them and offered them a partnership. That's what they were created for, and that's what they were in immediately upon being created before they fell away from that. So covenant needs to be understood against that backdrop. What another important concept that is not highlighted here on the title slide within Judaism is the concept of a remnant. So after humanity falls, there is this reiteration multiple times throughout the Hebrew Bible of God investing in a remnant. So he'll take some very small, or relatively, relative to the whole of humanity, small group of people and create a covenant with them that is sort of mirroring or at least hearkening back to the original partnership with all of humanity. Remember, the goal, if things had not gone awry, would have been God partnering with all of humanity, right? So this is really important because a very strong component of Judaism is that Jews are God's chosen people. But as we'll see, that was never in Judaism the original intent, or at least according to the Hebrew Bible. The original intent was God's partnership with all of humanity, Israel being eventually chosen as a remnant. So remnant is an important concept because it is God selecting a small subsection of humanity, a small subgroup within humanity to partner with, to do special things, to have a special covenant with, a special agreement. And the ultimate goal, this is why it's important to see it against the backdrop of the original partnership, is to get back to that partnership, to redeem all of humanity through the remnant, whether that's Israel or the other remnants that we will talk about here. Okay, so there were 4 big covenants in the Hebrew Bible. The first, now what we're going to talk about is each covenant, who he made it with, the human or the group of humans that God made the covenant with. And then because a covenant is a partnership, there are terms on either side of that partnership. So there's something the human or human group of humans is supposed to do, and there's something God is supposed to do. And spoiler alert, the way it always works is humans suck at fulfilling their side of the bargain, but God is a faithful and generous God who continues to choose remnants and continues to give second chances, continues to try to be faithful to his side of the bargain. His goal is to redeem all of humanity back into the original partnership from which they fell when they sinned, when they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Okay, so who is the first covenant made with? It's Noah. So God sees the horrible state as after the Garden of Eden, the fall, all of this spiraling down, things get worse and worse. And eventually God looks at his creation and he says, I need to wipe the slate clean. And I need to choose a remnant to survive the wiping of the slate clean so that I can start over. So he chooses Noah and Noah's family. And he tells Noah to take 2 of every animal onto an ark, which he tells him how to build. An ark is a big boat. Let me pull up a recreation for you. People have recreated, or at least attempted, to recreate Noah's ark. Here's a picture of it. There's even a movie that's not terribly old. Why did I do that? I don't need to click on that. It has Russell Crowe in it, and it's about Noah. It's apparently a pretty kind of imaginative retelling of the Noah story. But this is what I think the ark is supposed to have looked like. Obviously, they built it. They actually did. Probably cost a huge amount of money. And this is apparently at an exhibit in Kentucky called the Ark Encounter. Okay. So he was supposed to take 2 of every kind of animal because God was going to wipe everything out. Except, I guess, the stuff that lived in the water, like the fish and mammals in the water and stuff like that. So he has them go onto the boat. Everybody makes fun of Noah because they think he's crazy. And then God floods the earth. Flood narratives are common to many ancient texts. He floods the earth, wipes everything out, and Noah and his family survive. And the covenant that God makes with Noah is a weird covenant, actually, compared to the other ones, because it has no terms on Noah's part. There is just a promise on God's part not to do the same thing again. So he creates a rainbow, and this is a symbol that he will not flood the earth again. He will not destroy everything again. Some people see in this the symbol of a bow. So a rainbow obviously takes the form of like a semicircle. It's like a bow being pointed towards the sky. I like that as a bow and arrow if you were pointing it straight up towards the sky. And a lot of people read this because they think that in the ancient world, this was a symbol of peace, right? If you were riding to war and you wanted to signal to the opposing side that you were going to cease your aggression, you would point your bow up, as in, I'm not going to shoot at you. So God is showing peace towards humanity. Okay, so that didn't work out. Noah's family, again, spiraled down. Even Noah himself engaged in tons of really bad, sinful stuff. And eventually, God decides to make another covenant with another guy, and that was Abraham. And Abraham, we have what we call the Abrahamic religion. So it's not just Judaism that Abraham is important to. It's Islam, it's Christianity. I mean, well, of course Christianity, because all of the Hebrew Bible is significant to Christians. But Abraham, according to Judaism, God makes a covenant with him. And there are terms for Abraham, actually. So Abraham, on Abraham's side, he is supposed to trust God. This is where the famous story of him this famous story of him attempting to sacrifice his son comes from. God commands him. He tells Abraham, let's back up a little bit. Abraham's side of the covenant is to trust God and to bring his family up in justice. What is God's side of the covenant? That's Abraham's part of the deal. God's side is that he's going to bless Abraham's family, and he's going to bless him with land and flourishing of his flocks. And also, he is going to bless humanity through Abraham, right? And he tells Abraham, I will make your progeny like the stars of the sky. That will be the people that come from your seed, that come, ultimately from your children. Your children's children will be like the stars in the sky. So you trust me, bring your family up in justice. I will bless you, your family, your land, your flocks, and I will bless all of humanity through you by bringing peace to the world through your seed. Okay, so we could trace this to God's covenant with Abraham required that Abraham trust him. Abraham didn't trust God. There was a moment when he was not trusting God because he did not have a son, right? And of course, at least in terms of a male succession, God's part of the deal was not done. God had not fulfilled his part of the covenant by giving Abraham a son. His wife was really old. She was past the time when she could have children. And Abraham stopped trusting God, and instead, Sarah, his wife, convinced him to have sex with one of his, what do you call it? I'm blanking on the name. One of his other women that he slept with, and have like a son through that woman. And that woman was Hagar, and he had Ishmael through Hagar. And there's traditions on both sides of Islam and Islam and Judaism that is where Islam came from, or the Muslim heritage. But he doesn't trust God. God eventually does give him miraculously a son through Sarah. And then Abraham kicks Ishmael and Hagar out, sends them into the wilderness. We won't talk any more about that now. So he didn't trust God, but God continued to fulfill his promise to Abraham. That is part of the generosity of God that I talked about just a few minutes ago. That Abraham didn't fulfill his part of the covenant. God continued to fulfill his part of the covenant. And then, of course, there's a famous story where God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. And in the end, long story short, spoiler alert, he stops Abraham from killing Isaac right before he does. But he was testing Abraham because Abraham had shown a lack of faith in God, a lack of trust in God before. And he wanted to make sure, well, it's complicated interpreting that story, but on one reading, he wanted to make sure, although that's weird because God knows everything, even in the Jewish tradition. So it wasn't really for his sake, maybe, but he was somehow testing Abraham's trust in him. That's what he was doing. God presumably would have already known whether Abraham trusted him. So maybe that he wasn't trying to figure out for his own sake, but in some sense, he was testing Abraham's trust in him. Okay, that was the second covenant. Next, God makes a covenant with the people of Israel, with Israel as a whole. Right? So this is a group of people, the first covenant with a group as opposed to an individual. And the covenant with Israel is that, let's talk about both sides again. What happens on Israel? What is their part of the covenant? And what is God's part of the covenant? What is he going to do? What are they going to do? Well, what they need to do is obey the laws. And we'll talk about the laws now for just a second. There are 613 laws. You might have thought there are 10 laws. It's the 10 commandments. No, but there are 613, right? There's the 10 laws and then 603 more. I mean, there's the 10 commandments and then 613 more laws. And these are laws given to Israel that they're to follow for different reasons. We're going to categorize them into 4 different categories here in just a second. But just to get the big covenant picture, they need to follow those laws. They are to be, and then those following those laws makes them God's special remnant, his special representative to the world. They're supposed to be special and set apart. That's what the meaning of holiness is, to be set apart, right? And to be a light to the other nations. They're to represent God, to show the other nations what God is like. All of humanity has fallen away, and God is trying to redeem humanity, this time through the remnant of Israel, to take Israel, to make them his chosen people, to set them apart and show the rest of the world the kingdom of God, what living in full partnership with God would look like. Now, spoiler alert, they fail at it. But God's part is that he will give Israel protection, right? And blessing. But protection from what? Well, most focally from their enemies, right? They're surrounded on all sides by enemies. And God eventually, there's a strong theme, recurring theme within the Bible of God protecting Israel. But when they have refused and refused and refused to keep their side of the covenant, to fail and have failed to be just and have failed to be holy, God removes his protection. So this is an important thing, I think, to correct for our understanding. A lot of times that in the Hebrew Bible, in the Christian Old Testament, God is actually actively punishing people. But what he's actually doing is not an active punishment on his part. He's not sending the Assyrians to kill off the Israelites. He's saying there's a case to be made, at least, that what he's doing is he's giving them the natural consequences of their actions. To be out of relationship with God is to be to put themselves outside of the blessing of relationship with God, and that is going to allow them to be conquered by people who were trying to conquer them the whole time anyway, but God was protecting them. Okay, so let's take a pause real quick. I said there were 4 big covenants in the Hebrew Bible. We just talked about 3, but let's take an interlude to talk about the laws. Now, yes, there were the 10 commandments, and those are 10 of the laws. But there were 613. There are 613 mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. Now we can categorize them under 4 categories. This is not on a PowerPoint slide, so if you want to take notes here. Holiness, sacrifice, justice, and sacred time. Okay, so let's talk through those just a little bit. The holiness laws, and we'll look at a list of the laws here in just a second. Let me just go ahead and show you all a list of the laws here. Dang. Let's see here. Here we go. Here is a list of the 613 commandments. So if you were to study this list, you could make some distinctions, and you could categorize these roughly into every one of these into roughly one of the 4 categories that I just gave: holiness, sacrifice, justice, sacred time, right? You can see things as very general and universal, and something that you can imagine most people sympathizing with as to love God, or not to murder, not to oppress the weak. That would obviously be one that falls under justice, right? Not to gossip about others, not to take revenge. These seem to be it's easier to see these as universal moral laws, so to speak. But then there are things that we kind of would surprise someone not from a Jewish background that God would require of people. Not to attempt to engage the dead in conversation, not to consult the Ov, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, not to consult the Yidoni, not to perform acts of magic. Okay, let's go down a little bit more. To put a mezuzah on each doorpost, to wear tefillin on the head. Okay, so you can kind of see a lot of these things as more universal moral laws, and a lot of them as more particular to Israel's situation. So let's talk about holiness first. Let's talk about through those 4 categories. So let's talk about the third that I mentioned, justice first. These are going to be the ones that it's most easy to sympathize with and to see as kind of universal moral dictates, right? Don't oppress the weak. Don't embarrass people. Don't commit murder. Let's think about the 10 commandments. That's why the 10 commandments are so famous, right? Don't commit murder. Don't steal. Don't commit adultery. Those are going to be categorized under justice usually. Holiness, like I said, means to be set apart. So a lot of these things are rituals and customs that set Israel apart. So if we walked through enough of these, you would see a lot about circumcision, for example. Circumcision was a practice that set Israel apart and made them unique. Kosher laws about what you can and can't eat. Again, that's something about setting Israel apart, making them unique. There are laws about sacrifice in Israel, and for Jews, ancient Jews, they had to sacrifice animals in order to be able to come into the presence of God. There were elaborate sacrifice rituals around coming into the temple, and priests coming into the temple, coming into the Holy of Holies, all of these things, which is where God dwelled, that is. So there were lots of laws about sacrificing. If we walked through these, we would find a lot. And then finally, there are laws about sacred time. So all the things, everything about resting on certain days or during certain seasons, like I'm highlighting here, to rest on Rosh Hashanah. We'll talk about that in a little bit. That's a Jewish holiday. To rest on Sukkot. Again, my pronunciation here is probably horrible. These are laws about how to mark time, how to celebrate time, etc. So 613 of these things. I've only made it a sixth of the way through at this point. Not to have sexual relations with your wife's sister. It's a good one. Here's a whole section of them about sexual relations. Anyway, so a lot of scholars think that these 613 are not exhaustive of the laws that were given to Israel. And in particular, because these are all given in the Torah, across the 5 books of the Torah. But the way they're given is not in list form like this. You'll see if you scan through these enough, there's big gaps, right? So these come successively in Leviticus chapter 18, verse 15, then verse 16, then there's a little gap, then there's a bigger gap, right? But they're spread out over the course of the 5 books of the Torah. And what's actually happening there is they're not put in list form like this. They're in the middle of a narrative. The Torah is a narrative. It's telling a story, the story of, well, lots of stories strung together to be a bigger story, the story of Israel. And what's the way that they're lined up in the story is there will be, for example, you'll get some commandments, and then you'll have this more of the story of how Israel or whoever sucked at keeping those commandments. So, for example, when God gives Moses the 10 commandments and he brings them down from the mountain, God has, he's been up communing with God. God gives him the 10 commandments. He brings them back down to the people. And then the people, one of the commandments is not to worship idols. And then immediately after, you get the story of the people creating a golden calf and worshiping it. That'd be an idol according to Judaism. And this is the sort of pattern that happens. You'll get some commandments, story of how the people break those commandments. They suck at keeping them. So then you some more commandments and the story of how the people suck at keeping those commandments. So that leads a lot of people to think this is not the entirety of the commandments. It's sort of giving you examples of those commandments. Okay. Anyway, interlude. That's to talk about those 613 commandments, possibly more commandments that constitute the law. And that was Israel's part of keeping their covenant. Finally, the 4th covenant was with David. David was a king of Israel. These are in chronological order, by the way. Noah came first, and Abraham, and then the nation of Israel came out of Abraham. Those were the stars of the sky, so to speak. And David came along after Israel was established, and he became their first king. Israel wanted a king like the other nations, and he was their first king. And God made a covenant with David that he would obey the law and he would lead Israel faithfully. And God's part of that covenant was that one of David's sons, or progeny in general, would bring the kingdom of peace, the kingdom of God, to the world. So when humanity fell, when humanity fell and sinned, remember that was there was the overlap of heaven and earth in Eden. God and humans dwelt together. And when humanity sinned, those realms came apart. Humanity no longer dwelled in the same place as God. And lots of sin came into the world as a part of that, and death and suffering. But the ultimate goal, like I've been saying, and through all of these covenants, these particular covenants with people, individuals or small groups of people, relatively small, was to bring back the ultimate partnership of humanity with God. And God promises David, if he keeps his part of the covenant, that God's part of the covenant would be to do that, to accomplish that work of bringing back the union of heaven and earth, the partnership of humanity and God through one of David's progeny. And this is the origin of the prophecy about a Messiah. a Jewish Messiah who would come and bring God's kingdom back to earth. The partnership of God and humanity would be complete again, would be perfect again. Okay, so those are the 4 covenants. I talked through them. Now I'm going to give you sort of summary here. Noah, the covenant with Noah required nothing of Noah. God's part was not destroying the earth again. The covenant with Abraham had Abraham trust God and bring his family up in justice. God's part was to bless Abraham, bless his family, bless him through his land and his flocks, etc., and bless humanity through this. The partnership with Israel was that Israel obey the law. That's a typo. The law being constituted by those 613 commandments, and to be God's representative in the world, to represent him, especially, more than any other given people. And God would protect Israel and bless them. His covenant with David was that David would obey the laws. Again, I guess I was just not thinking clearly when I did this. Obey the law and lead Israel faithfully. And God's part was that one of David's sons would bring the kingdom of God to the world. Okay, so that is the covenant, the concept of covenant in general, the theme of covenant running throughout the Hebrew Bible, and the concept of law, that is those 613 commandments, which were Israel's part of the covenant. And that's where we'll stop for now.